So welcome back to the Confidence Conversations podcast. If you're a new listener, you're really welcome, or listener or watcher. And if you're back for more, then welcome back. So I'm Gayle Tong. I'm the founder of Enrichment Coaching. I'm a qualified accredited coach, and my focus is all around helping you to turn your self-doubt into confident action through one-to-one coaching. I work mainly with small business owners and mid to senior level managers on all aspects of confidence, and I work with people across all different industries. So do get in touch if you're interested to know how one-to-one coaching might work for you. So back to the podcast. This is series 4 of the Confidence Conversations podcast. And on this episode 2 of series 4, I'm joined by the brilliant Melissa Hague. She's a coach, a facilitator, and in my eyes, she's a courage builder without a doubt. Melissa has been on the podcast before in the last series where we explored courage and its link to confidence. And I could chat to Melissa all day long, so I knew she'd be coming back for us to have another confidence conversation. So in the last episode, Emma Vander and I explored this idea of core confidence. So continuing on that theme, Melissa and I in this episode explore something that comes up time and time again in coaching, and that is values. So Melissa shares with us how her values like curiosity, expertise, that was a very interesting conversation around that value, and home shape how she shows up in life and in work, and also how they support confidence, even when Betty, that voice of self-doubt, as Betty's my inner critic, is really loud. We talk through what it means to live your values and how they might evolve, how they can help you be more confident and help you to manage nerves, indecision, making decision all at the same time. So I'd say to you, if you're at a position where maybe you're struggling to name your values, you don't really know where to start or understand how they might work for you, equally what they might look like in everyday life, and more importantly, maybe you're interested in this link to confidence, then this episode with Melissa is the one for you. Enjoy. So hi everyone, we are back with the Confidence Conversations podcast, and today I'm excited to welcome back Melissa Hague again. Hi.
Hello.
So we today are going to talk about, in terms of kind of the turning self-doubt into confident action and the sections of the podcast where we're starting with kind of core confidence, we're moving on to mindset, confident mindset, and then confidence in work, in action in work and in business. But we're looking at kind of the core confidence. And the thing I wanted to talk about with Melissa today is values, because they come up loads, don't they? So before we do that, welcome back. Give us I know you've been on before. You actually, the most watched episode of the last series, was yours. So if you're interested in that, you can go back and see that. And we talked last time about courage and confidence, didn't we? Which was fascinating. But for people that may not have heard of you before, I can't believe there's anybody out there that doesn't know who you are. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Thank you, Gayle, and thank you for having me back as well. It's always lovely to come back and chat with you. So I appreciate you inviting me. So I'm Melissa Hague, and I am a coach and facilitator, working with leaders and also with coaches. And I guess my area of passion, if you like, is around courage and courage building, and what that looks like in both leadership and also for coaches as well, based around the work of Brené Brown, but also Kristen Neff and Susan David. But yeah, I'm all about courage and being courageous with our lives, whether that's at work, at home, or anywhere else. So yeah, it's good to be here.
Amazing. And the reason I'm kind of chuckling away to myself here is because I noticed you kind of stopped yourself from saying a word which I imagine was probably expert, my area of expertise.
Yeah. I was actually thinking exactly along those lines. Specialism was what was coming up for me. And I was like, I don't want to say that. I don't like that. I don't want to say I'm an expert or a guru. And that's probably something that we'll come on to when we get into values, to be fair. But yeah, I stumble over the I don't want to say that out loud. Yeah, definitely.
I don't want to say what I'm really good at.
No, absolutely.
But actually, I love how you kind of did then reframe that into my area of passion, because I think that's where we're all at, isn't it? So I've just recently completed some imposter syndrome coach training, and it's called the Imposter Syndrome Informed Coach. And of course, it doesn't make me an expert at all in it by any stretch of the imagination. But what it has done is it's given me a little bit of knowledge. And it's reinforced my knowledge. But now I need to be really careful. Now I've got all this knowledge that I don't come across as a bit of a dick.
Yeah. And here's the thing, right? I think for me, I worry that if I say, I'm an expert, or I have a specialism in courage and courage building, what that sort of screams in my head, and what I worry it says to other people, is that I'm really courageous as a person, and I know how to be courageous, and I'm always courageous. And it's probably the same for you with confidence, right? I always feel confident. I'm the most confident person ever. And for me, that's not true. I'm always, falling over and, choosing comfort instead of courage. And I still struggle, and I'm still working on it. I just happen to help other people work on it as well. So I think that's where the discomfort comes from me. I don't want people to think that I've got it all sorted and I've got all the answers, because I don't. I really don't.
Yeah, and I can totally relate to that. Although I do have a little bit of, and I'm sure you experience this as well, that, well, actually, if people perceive me as the most confident person in the room, then if I'm doing a pitch or I'm facilitating, or then that's how I have to come across. And of course, that isn't always true. It just doesn't work like that.
Absolutely.
So let's get on to values then.
Okay.
I think values comes up in lots of different ways. But tell me, I suppose my first question is, how would you describe values to someone who doesn't know maybe what they are?
Yeah. I always love starting with what the heck do we mean by this thing we're about to talk about, because there's this assumption that everyone must know what they are. And I think I can certainly share what they mean for me. So values are really all about how I show up in the world. That they are who I am when I am at my best. They define me. And they're also kind of almost a filter that I use to make decisions about how I live my life, how I want to spend my time, what work I want to do, what work I don't want to do. So they're also that kind of filter, I guess. But primarily, I feel like my values are a part of almost my identity. They define who I am, but who I am when I'm at my best.
Yeah, I love that definition of who I am when I'm at my best, because I've got values, and we'll come on to talk about a bit more about what they are. And I think you're right. I think when you're doing your best work, or you're in your best place, you're living out all of those. But again, I suppose we don't live them out all the time, maybe as much as we'd like to. But I think that you're right. They're a filter that we aim to live by. They help us make decisions. Certainly that's how I have found mine have played a part, particularly in my business. So I would say that when I was in corporate employed, we were given a set of values. These are our values. We must live by this. And actually, sometimes those values that a business have maybe don't resonate with you personally. But what I might say about my values is they sit across my business and Gayle, if there is a differentiation, right, between enrichment coaching and Gayle. I think sometimes we're one and the same thing when that kind of happens when you run your own business. So what are your core values then?
Okay, so I have 5 core values, and I say currently, I mean, we might talk about that a little bit, because I think values do shift and change over time, not kind of fixed for me. But currently, my 5 values are curiosity, expertise, which people might be smiling at now after our previous discussion about expertise. But curiosity, expertise, connection, home, and loyalty. So those are my 5.
And how did you go about identifying those?
Well, initially, like I think many people, and like I now do with clients, I identified my values during through coaching, and I actually did it during my coach training. You know, the coach who was facilitating, we went through a values exercise, and that was really the first time that I identified what my values were. But at that time, it was very much kind of, here's a list of words, and kind of pick some words that resonate with you. Let's talk about what they mean and why they're important, and et cetera, et cetera. And that was really helpful. But how I've developed in my own learning around values is that the words are great, but what's really important is what they mean behaviorally. So how do I show up in the world, right? What if someone didn't know what my values were but spent time with me? You know, if I didn't tell them what my values were and they spent time with me, would they be able to see my values simply from kind of the way I show up and the way I behave in our relationship? And so over time, I've really kind of dug into defining what those words actually mean for me behaviorally, because they might mean something different to someone else and how they show up, right? So, but what do they mean for me? And probably linked to what we said earlier, the one I grappled with the most is expertise. I didn't want to call it expertise for a long, long time. I called it competence for a while as a value. And then I was like, it's not competence, it's expertise. And there's a lot of history attached to that word for me. So I had to kind of unpack what that was all about. But yeah, I think over time, I've chosen words that mean something to me, but also show up for me behaviourally. I think home is, I don't think I've ever actually seen home on a list of, you know, those word lists or card deck people. I don't think home is in there, but that's a meaningful word to me. And I know what it looks like on how it shows up in my behaviours. So they've become mine over many years, really, of working with them. But that's how it started. Here's a list, pick some words. And over time, they've become much more about behaviours, and they've kind of evolved with me as I've changed, you know, careers, and my life's changed, different life stage, you know, all of those things.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how we get to the set of first words, but then also the behaviours. And I think you're right about the behaviours. I think words on a page are great, right? But actually, what does it mean and how are we living those out? So yeah. I'm really interested in your expertise one, really curious about that. I'm also quite curious about the home one, because that feels like it's quite different. And then we have one in common, which is courage.
Mm-hmm. So well, I have connection. Sorry, I don't have courage as a value.
Oh, you have connection. Sorry, I'm hearing things then. That's my age.
Well, yes, but also it's almost like you would think, wouldn't you? Having said that, one of my passions is courage, and but the courage would be in there. But it is in there, but in other ways. Oh, there's a whole other thing that we might talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then, talk to me then about, well, which one do you want to expand on for the listeners?
Ooh, well, that's a good question.
There's a question.
Well, yeah, I guess, look, let's go with the ones that kind of piqued your interest, because I think they are the ones that most people, or some people, might think, well, what does that actually mean? And I think I can't really talk about expertise without talking about curiosity, because those two values are probably the ones that fight the most. So we kind of assume that all of our values will get on with each other and will interlink and align and everything will be fine and lovely and dandy. But the reality is, for me, is that curiosity and expertise tend to fight, because expertise is all about knowing and curiosity is all about not knowing. So they get cross with each other sometimes, right? And they have a little fight with each other. And so I think for me, expertise is about, I really value expertise in myself. I'm a lifelong learner. If there's something, that I'm going to become, like, for example, one time I worked in financial services for a mortgage broker, and I did all my CMAP mortgage qualifications. I wasn't a mortgage advisor. I was in learning and development, but that was what I was in, and therefore I should do the qualifications. So this kind of real need to become an expert in whatever arena I was in has really kind of defined my career journey, really, my life too, probably. But for me now, I've stopped fighting my expertise, and I think about how I want to use it. and when I want to use it, when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate, when it helps me and when it doesn't help me. And so expertise and curiosity are almost like, I kind of think of them as like the graphic equalizer, a child of the 80s and 90s, on the stereo, that in some parts of my life, I have to really dial up my curiosity and kind of quieten my expertise a little bit. And then in other scenarios, it's the other way around. So there's a real interplay between those two for me, definitely. And still, I struggle with calling myself an expert in anything, because I think what that says, I worry that other people's perceptions of that will be, she's either, she thinks she knows all there is to know. Well, that's actually not what expertise means for me. There's lots that I don't know, and I'm learning all of the time, but I see all that learning as adding real colour and flavour and richness to my expertise. So yeah, I am careful about how I use the word, because I have a discomfort with how I think people will perceive the word. But it's in there, and I've learned now, when people say, "What are your values?" I say it out loud, I own it, rather than kind of shrinking away from it. Definitely. What was the other one? Oh, home. You asked about home as well. So I think home came about really because quite often, again, in those values lists, you see things like security or stability, and sometimes that's financial, sometimes it isn't. And home for me represents something really important, because it's not about the bricks and mortar, right, of my house, as it were. It really is that kind of sense of being safe, having a safe place, somewhere that or I know I can go back to and it will be safe, which enables me to be more courageous, because I can step out of that safety and do stuff knowing that I can come back to the safety of home. But also, home for me is about the place where I am most myself, the place where I'm most grounded in who I am. And interestingly, I think home shows up a lot more in my work than maybe you might think it might do. So, for example, you've been on my gatherings. I run an annual gathering for my coach community. And, when it came to selecting the venue for that, I was very deliberate about what I want this venue to be like. I don't want it to be a conference venue or a hotel or kind of have any kind of corporate thing going on. Actually, what I want it to be is a home, with a kitchen and a lounge and a dining room and bedrooms. And I want it to feel like our home for the period of that gathering. So that this value of home really also influences how I show up and how I do my work, and how I make decisions about how I do my work. So I don't travel a great deal for work. Most of my work, I'm based in Dorset, and most of my work is local. I'm just going to kind of broadly say the south of England. And if someone says to me, "Can you come and deliver a week-long course in Newcastle?" and I'm going to be away from home, from my space and everything that means for me, then I don't do that. I'm not interested in that kind of work. So it also shows up in how I choose the work I choose as well. So it's a really important value for me. And I happen to call it home. I mean, there are probably other words people might use, but home also creates quite a visceral, safe, warm feeling for me. So I like having it in there, as well as it makes me feel good having it in the list,
I like as well that link between, a bit about your comfort zone and how you might step out and you've got a safe place to come back to. But I also like the link, you mentioned the gathering, and certainly that was my feeling. It didn't feel like somewhere that was formal or, anything like that. And I think I said to you, I'm going on another one, and they asked for some feedback about, what they called them retreats. I know you don't call that, but what, and I was like, oh, well, this, and this. And it was all taken from what you'd done, because it felt so relaxed and you created there such a homely environment that learning was able to happen. And, you know, you felt, I've said to you before that is one of the only spaces where I haven't felt any kind of comparison that's then affected my confidence in that. So actually, I think the value that then we have in common is curiosity, not courage, it's curiosity. And for me, that curiosity is about, the behavior that I've got underneath that is to never accept the first answer and to have a strong desire to question, challenge, learn, and seek to understand. And I think you and I are both in that space of being on a learning adventure, or I have a real thing about the word journey. So learning adventure all the time, that actually sometimes the destination of that learning isn't as important as the path that you take, if you like. Because it's that builds the expertise. But like you, I would never, and I actually think it's knowing you as I do, it's quite brave of you to have expertise in your values, especially as you're sitting with that being a little bit uncomfortable for you.
And I think that interestingly, I do wonder over time if my expertise value might fade away. It hasn't yet. There's a little bit of me that hopes it will, because I don't want to own it, I guess. But I think the balance for me is having curiosity in there as well. Because just like you, curiosity is certainly from a coaching perspective. Curiosity for me is I am endlessly curious about what this person is going to say. Like people astound me, right? They're in good ways and in bad ways, of course, but people astound me, and I'm just endlessly curious about where this conversation, this interaction, where is it going to go? And that's it requires courage, because actually not knowing is uncomfortable. But if I dial up my curiosity, that helps me to sit with that discomfort of not knowing. And so I think about, you know, what would, and this is where the behavioral piece comes in, what would showing up with curiosity look like in this interaction? So in a coaching conversation, what would curiosity look like? Well, for me, right off the bat is, I don't know where this is going to go. I have no idea where this is going to go. So how can I be curious about what might happen? So there is that real curiosity is I love curiosity, and I love curiosity in others. And I think this is something I have to watch because it's a value for me, a really important value. And I work hard to kind of really live into it and lean into it, is that I get really frustrated when I find other people and they're not curious. I find it really frustrating. I'm like, why are you not curious about this? Why aren't you curious about yourself, or why you're behaving in this way, or why you're not making this change? Why aren't you curious about that? And again, I have to really manage that, because just because it's my value doesn't mean it's someone else's. So there's I think one of the things I would say about values is that once you've found them and you identify them, and you know you do the work around kind of behavior, creating behaviors around them, doesn't mean that it's easy to live into your values. Actually, it's really hard work sometimes to live into your values. So I think that's an important thing to say. This is not easy work to do. Oh, now I've got my values, that's it. I can just show up and it'll all be great. It's really hard to live into your values, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think where I've noticed them for me is they come like a shining light, if you like. That's a bit woo-woo, isn't it? In moments of doubt, or when things don't feel quite right, maybe something doesn't sit quite right, it's always good to come back to values. So mine are impact, authenticity, courage, curiosity, integrity, and determination. And actually, if I was to order them, probably my top two would be courage and determination. Because I don't think actually without courage and determination, you can have some of the others. But my next question for you then is, in all of that we've said about values, how for you do they link to confidence?
So it's an interesting question, because I was thinking about this beforehand. I was thinking, obviously, I'm here on confidence conversations. We're going to talk about confidence, but I'm also talking about values. So I was thinking about, how do my values give me confidence? And
or maybe it's courage, right?
Because
you talked before about the two are so, you almost can't have one without the other.
Yeah, so I was thinking about actually what my values do is they enable me to think about how do I want to show up in this space in a way that's in alignment with my values. Um, and I'm not sure that that makes me feel any more confident in that moment. I might, I'm still nervous or I'm still anxious or my, self-doubt is still there. But there's also another voice in my head that says, that's showing me or talking me through the kind of, this is what my values look like in this moment as a behavior. And so I can be confident that in this moment, whatever the moment is, I'm showing up with my values. I'm showing up with my grounded confidence, which is all part of courage. And so I might still feel nervous and anxious, or I might be worried about what I'm about to do. That doesn't mean I don't still have a level of confidence. And that got me thinking about, can I hold both? If I'm living into my values, does that help me to hold both things at the same time, right? The nerves, the anxiety, the self-doubt, but also that self-trust and self-belief. Can I hold both at the same time, as opposed to getting rid of one in order to get the other? And so that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think this idea of values and their link to confidence is more about, can I hold what appear to be conflicting things at the same time, right?
Yeah. And I think you can, right? Because I think that because there will be elements in that of, let's say it's a facilitation for example, you will be confident in what you've prepared, right? In your knowledge, not necessarily your expertise, but your knowledge. There'll be lots of things to be confident about, but you will still, over on the other scale, if you like, be nervous about who's going to turn up, how is it going to go, are all the activities going to go as I've planned, are we going to stick to time, who's going to engage, who's not, all of those things. So I think you can hold the two things. And then I think maybe that's where your values come into play, because they almost reinforce your self-trust and that feeling of, I know I've got this, and whatever happens, it's all going to be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that when using facilitation as an example is, sometimes when I'm facilitating, I'll notice, I'll come away from a session and I notice that during the session, my confidence really kind of got chipped away at, little by little. And by the end of the session, I feel a lot less confident than I perhaps have done previously or in other examples. And when I reflect on that, it is nearly always because I haven't shown up in the way that I would like to. So I'm not at my best. I haven't shown up in that environment in the way that I want to, and that chips away at my confidence through a session. And someone asks a question and I think, I don't know what the answer is or whatever. And I think afterwards, yes, I do. Of course I know what the answer is. But it's like a slow kind of chipping away at your confidence. And I think that comes from not living into your values in that moment, in that facilitation, right?
Yeah, and actually what came to mind in there was that, for me, that's where that curiosity bit would turn back around, because I used to have a few tricks, I've probably mentioned them before, that, if somebody asked a question and in that moment, like you say, your confidence is chipped because you're like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. Be curious and throw it back out. So what does everyone else think? Because you guarantee there'll always be somebody in the room that has a view or an opinion or a thought on that as well.
Yeah.
So what happens then to your confidence when you go against your values, whether that's something that's intentional or not intentional?
So I think that the kind of not living into our values. So sometimes we are external forces or the system around us means that we live outside of our values. You mentioned earlier on about working in an organization, for example, that doesn't align with your values, that that we're almost required to live outside of our values in those kind of situations. And then I think sometimes we cause it ourselves, if you see what I mean. We behave in a way that isn't in line with our values, and sometimes, as you say, intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, or knowingly or unknowingly, right? And I think that the first thing I'd say is that, as I've already said, it's not easy to live into your values. So the first thing is to not beat yourself up, and to offer yourself self-compassion when it happens. That's really important. But I also think that in terms of how it affects my confidence, that self-compassion piece is really important. Because if you aren't self-compassionate, then that's when, recognize that this is hard. That's when the self-doubt gets louder and your inner critic starts banging their drum. And that is that's chipping away, as I say, at your confidence. And I think that it is like an erosion over time, because you're not living into your values, and then over time there's this slow chipping away at confidence. And certainly in my experience, it doesn't really happen overnight, and suddenly you're doing something that you've done many times before, and you think, what's happened to my confidence here? Because I'm racked with self-doubt. I don't want to do this. I want to pull a sickie. I want to have a duvet day because I just don't want to be doing whatever it is that I need to do. And I think it's because we let self-doubt be really loud, and we don't practice or counterbalance that with self-compassion. So yeah, I think values and confidence are, I was going to say interrelated, but I think what I mean by that is that if we're really clear on what our values are and what they look like, it's much easier or quicker for us to recognize when, oh, hang on, I'm living outside of my values. What needs to change? What can I do about that? How do I want to show up differently next time? Whereas if we're not as aware of our values and how they show up behaviorally, then it almost happens for us without awareness. And then before we know it, we're burnt out or saying no to stuff that we should really be saying yes to, all of those kind of things. So it always comes back to awareness, gives us choice. And without that awareness, we're doing stuff and we don't realize the impact it's having on us, I think.
And so then, have you ever walked away from something because it didn't meet with your values?
So yes, I mean, there's definitely been work that I've walked away from. I mentioned earlier about, work that requires me to travel or be away from home, and so that is not in line with my values. And I've got in fact, to be fair, since I've been self-employed, I've nearly always, I think there's only maybe one example of where I've gone, oh, all right, then I'll do it for you, and then regretted it. So, but I think there are lots of times, I say lots. I'm going to retract that. Not lots. There have been some times where I've walked away from work because it didn't align with my values. I struggle with, as I mentioned, curiosity. So if I find over time that clients, there's not this curiosity piece, and obviously we can work on that and help people develop their curiosity. But if there's a real they're just not prepared to be curious about themselves, that's a really hard place for me to work. So I have kind of said to clients, I'm not the right coach here, right? I'm not the right coach for you in those scenarios. And I also think it's also led to me kind of walking away from work where when I started coaching, I was working as an internal coach. So it's slightly different, right? You're not walking away from work with a financial implication. But I did find as an internal coach that I would often get a clash with my loyalty value, where clients weren't being loyal to the organization, and that I really struggled with. So that was often a time when we would get external coaches for them and so on, because I find it really hard to work with them. So, and interestingly, I think for me, whilst having the conversation was hard, I don't think I'm the right coach for you. And, and these are the reasons why. That conversation was hard for sure and needed courage. But afterwards it was relief, right? And that confidence to, do you know what, actually, yes, I can have the tough conversations. and I can do it in a way that's kind, but also I need to meet my needs as well as the other person, whoever that is, right? So in the moment it was tough, but afterwards I think it actually kind of increased my self-belief and my confidence, because actually, do you know what, I do know myself well enough, and I can to know what's what's not right for me, and I can have the confidence to have the conversation and walk away if I need to, right?
And for me, that's where there's courage in yes and courage in no, right? So
Mm. Oh,
as you would, as I asked you that question, I was thinking about where have I walked away from work, and there is a specific example I can think of where somebody asked me to do something in an industry that I was unfamiliar with, very corporate. And whilst I could do the work, inside I was starting to, maybe Betty was there, yeah, Betty's my inner critic, maybe she was saying, oh, is this really for you, Gayle? And whilst I'm always up for, as you know, pulling up my big pants, going off and doing it, stepping out of my comfort zone, I think my value of integrity took over there. Because this value of integrity, to be honest, to have strong moral principles and do the right thing even when no one is looking, the right thing there was to say no in service of the client, the person that was offering me the work, and myself. So to say no to that, like you say, there's a bit of confidence and a bit of courage in saying yes and no, because it was the right thing to do. And that's when kind of, my value, my integrity value, kind of showed up, if you like.
Yeah.
Okay, so go on. Sorry.
No. I was nodding and agreeing.
Okay. So what would be your advice then to someone who wants to live into their values more, but they're struggling to know where to start?
So I think there's several stages to values work, really. I think the first stage is you've got to identify them, right? And that's really picking the words. Now, I say that lightly, but it isn't simply just, oh, let me pick the words I like from this list. I think the identification of that needs to be done with someone else, whether that's a coach or a mentor. But I don't think it's, well, because I think you need to think about, why am I choosing that word? What does it mean for me? How has that showed up in my life already? So there's a load of kind of questions and exploration, not just picking words randomly because you like them, right? So there's a bit of work in that identification. But I think the real value of values work comes when you're ready to say, well, okay, I know what that word means to me. I know where it's come from and how it shows up in my life. But what does it mean behaviorally? So when you start to, Brene Brown calls it operationalizing your values. What does that actually look like in reality? Because I think that involves a lot of reflective practice, and thinking about, how did I show up in that interaction, in that space, and how's that linked to my values? And then, of course, once you've done that, you can start to think about, okay, I'm about to go into this moment, this conversation, whatever it might be. What's going to be, how my values going to show up in this? How do I want my values to show up in this space? And not just, oh, I'm going to go into this space and be really curious because that's my value, but I'm going to go into this space, and I'm going to remember to take a breath when my knower says in my head, I know what the answer is. I'm going to remember to just take a breath and create some space for myself. I'm going to, ask curious questions rather than leading questions. So how will I actually show up in this space? So you've kind of got to do the reflective practice stuff to learn all of that, to then be able to start preparing for the future. So I think identify them, operationalize them, and then really start to reflect on, how do they show up behaviorally for you in your life and your, not just work, but your life as well. Because that's something I said, sorry, Gayle, that's something I haven't said, which I think is really important. You kind of alluded to it earlier on, is I don't think we have different values at work than we do at home, than we do, in our team or sports team or hobbies or whatever. We just have values, right? The priorities might change in different environments, but we just have values. So yeah, it's you as a whole human, not just what do they look like at, what are they at work, and they're different at home. I think
I think your point about working with somebody is really true as well. I think you can get to a point on your own, probably, But then I think to have that external view on it is also really helpful. But I think to your point there, it should be somebody that will have an unbiased opinion and will give you feedback, not the feedback that you want to hear, and then just go, oh yeah, they're lovely words. Yeah, they really describe you, because that isn't what this is about.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, one of the things I often say to clients that I do values work with is I say, once they've kind of they've started to really get friendly and know these words and understand what they mean for them, I will sometimes suggest, go and ask a couple of people who you feel know you really well, but will give you constructive feedback. They're not just going to smooth you and say, oh yes, they're lovely words. Go and ask someone who's going to challenge you, but knows you really well, and ask, how do you see these showing up? Do you recognize these in me? That can be really useful, that feedback. So that's definitely part of the process as well, I'd say.
So I think one of the things I remember from the Dare to Lead training as well was, and you did talk about this earlier, but I think the words you used then were, if an alien was to come down from outer space and follow you around, what would they observe you doing? Would they be able to say that these were your values? And that stuck with me. And I've actually used that with a couple of clients, because it helps them sometimes just to contextualize, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So for this series, I'm doing quick fire questions with guests. So here we go. Are you ready?
I am ready, although I'm already panicking about the word quickfire, because really short.
No, I say quickfire, but they don't need to be that short, but they're just the same 4 questions that I'm asking everybody. So the first one is, when was the last time you felt confident? What were you doing? Who were you with? Where were you? That's about 50 questions, I realise.
It is about 50 questions in one. So I was, so I think the last time I felt confident was when I ran, and you were there actually, I ran a courage clinic last week. And that was the immediate example that came to mind. So it was an online session, live Q&A session, where people came along, asked me questions, and I answered them, right? It was a room full of coaches. Some people came live, some people shared their questions beforehand. But I think what's really important about that is that I wasn't confident when I started the session. It was I'd never done it before. I thought I'll give it a go. Didn't really know how it was going to go. It absolutely lent into my expertise, because I got to answer people's questions. But I had to do some thinking beforehand about, okay, how do I want to be curious as well, though? Because I this is not me giving everyone the right answers. These are just my answers, and I didn't feel confident at the beginning. But by the end, I thought that went okay. And I feel confident enough that I could do this again.
Yeah, and it did, and it was brilliant, and it was a really quick hour, because, I think I said this to you at the end, I wondered how it might go with it being a Q&A when people weren't generally, I think there was only me and maybe a couple of others that actually spoke, which is fine, because everybody leans into how they want to do it. But I did wonder, and actually it was brilliant. I got some great top tips, and there were some brilliant questions as well, things that you don't consider. So yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Really interesting. Yeah. So what's a non-negotiable for you about your confidence?
What's a non-negotiable? So it's mine, and I own it. And yeah, so it doesn't matter what other people think. It's mine. My confidence is mine. And yeah, I need to hold on to it and not let other people dent it or chip away at it. Only I am allowed to do that. And I do it a lot, but only I am allowed to do that, for sure.
Yeah, I love that. One piece of advice to turn self-doubt into confident action.
Don't fight your self-doubt. Don't fight it. It's there. I'd love to tell you can get rid of it and it can go away, but it's a really human thing. So for me, there's something about how do you quieten your self-doubt, and what that kind of voice, what other voices might you bring in alongside it? So for me, it's my self-compassionate voice, right? My self-compassionate voice, it doesn't always work, but I try for my self-compassionate voice to be as loud, and sometimes louder, but as loud as my voice of self-doubt.
Brilliant. And one daily confidence habit that you'd recommend?
So I'm going to steal one actually from Amy Wilkinson, who I know you know, and she has something called a to-do list, which,
Yes.
yeah, you know, where she
Yeah.
kind of writes down her achievements in a day or whatever, what she's achieved. And I think it for me, it's such a valuable piece of advice as a kind of habit that you can build. And I don't do it every day, but if I've had a day, and sometimes these are frequent, sometimes less so, but if I've had a day where I feel a bit demotivated, a bit like, what am I doing? Or even at worst, right, who do I think I am, right, trying to do this, and that's all the self-doubt stuff. Then I will use I've got a to-do list as long as my arm, but I'll also have a to-do list with, okay, but this is what I've achieved so far this week, this is what I'm proud of. Or just simply, sometimes it's, I got the washing on the line this morning. I've achieved adulting in my life, and that's enough, right? But yeah, so yeah, exactly. So as a habit, a confidence habit, the to-do list, as I say, full credit to Amy, but yeah, that's a great habit.
I actually call my to-do list to-do list,
Ah,
which I did before I met Amy. But Amy, quick plug for Amy, she does actually have a book, doesn't she?
she does. Yes, she does.
Yeah, which is, I love this idea of, we're always quick, aren't we, to say, I've got my to-do list is as long as my arm. Okay, so what's your to-do list look like?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if I remember, we'll share the link to
Yeah.
Amy's
Brilliant.
book. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, Melissa, thank you. It's been amazing. We could talk forever about values, courage, confidence, and how it all kind of wraps up into one big thing. But thank you. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you?
So either connect with me on LinkedIn simply by searching Melissa Hague, or have a look at my website, which again, very simply is www.melissahague.com. Which, and reach out. I love a conversation. So, don't be fearful of me trying to sell you something. If you want to just chat, I'd love to connect and have a conversation. Definitely.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you, Gayle. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
And I'll see everybody next time on the Confidence Conversations podcast. Oh, so I just loved that conversation with Melissa. And I love really digging deep into kind of values, how they play out. And I was thinking about what the takeaways were really from that conversation. And I think for me, it's about that, what values aren't just words. What they need to be is behaviors. So they help us to show up, help us to make decisions. They give us something to come back to when we may be having a few confidence wobbles, or we're feeling like we can't make a decision because we don't know if it sits with our values, but we might not immediately know that we need to come back to our values. And that might be saying no to stuff, work that doesn't feel right, or finding that kind of courage in sitting with the discomfort of something that you're working on, or growth. Values kind of, I can't really think of a better word, but they're like a compass or an anchor for you to come back to and check in with. Something feels a bit off. Does this sit with my values? If not, why not? And then what can I or could I do about that to make a difference? I think one thing for me as well is values help me with comparisonitis. And there's an episode in the last series with Claire Henley where we talk about comparisonitis. And, they say it's the thief of joy. But I think what it helps me to do is to come back to them and remind myself to stay in my own lane, do my own thing, keep going even when things feel really tough. So look, I think if you're thinking about your values and maybe you want to build your confidence, so get curious about your values, name them, think about the behavior that sits underneath them. You can see mine on my website if you want to go there and have a look. That's enrichmentcoaching.co.uk. You can see what the behavior is that sits underneath that for me. And then I think take the time to notice how and where they're showing up in your everyday life. And I said it in the episode with Melissa, but one of the things from one of the Brené Brown work in Dare to Lead is where she said, if an alien came down and they followed you around for a few days, would they see your behaviours playing out, and what would they look like? And I think it's also interesting to take somebody's feedback, somebody that knows you, and maybe that isn't a family member or a friend. Maybe it's a trusted work friend or a co-worker or a business friend that you've got that you trust to give you feedback on. Yeah, do you know what? That's definitely a value I'm seeing. Or think about where that value might have played its part. There's some great cards out there that I use. I think they're called By Two Bored Blokes. And but you can go on any of the, just search for them. To be fair, the internet will give you loads of choices where you can have a list of values that you can choose from, but make sure that they're really something that you can operationalize, so to speak, that they become your behaviors and they become this thing that you can come back to if something feels a little bit off, and you can anchor yourself in those values. So yeah, thanks to Melissa for joining us again. Great conversation. And I hope you took something away from that one. And I'll see you for the next episode very soon.